Namaste, mero nam Naomi ho, mero das Canada ho, ma bitiati ho, ma libert sangha kam gordechu. That was the introduction I gave for every community meeting in Nepal, and despite being very comfortable around people, it took me a while to get used to that one. So where is Nepal? It's located between India and Tibet, and actually Nepal is it's less than a quarter the area of Manitoba, but has a population similar to that of Canada. So lots of people, and it's actually where Mount Everest is located too. So before I get started, my family was quite adamant that I clear something up about this poster that's up. And in it, I'm planting rice in Jumla, Nepal. And that woman behind me is actually picking my rice and replanting it for me because I wasn't doing it right. So it took me a while to figure that one out. It's more complicated, apparently, than it looks. So I worked with an organization called LEBIRD, which stands for Local Initiatives for Biodiversity Research and Development. And they really work to reduce poverty and promote social justice through helping the rural poor, particularly those who are dependent on natural resources for their livelihoods. So first, when I started off, I went to Pokhara, which is the third largest city in Nepal. And I was surprised at how hard it was to adjust to life in Nepal, despite the fact that I was living in a beautiful area, in a nice hotel, with lots of tourists, and all the amenities that tourists like to have. But it was a great opportunity for me to start to understand some of the development issues in Nepal. For one, I learned about load shedding. So basically, there's lots of power outages. And there's an electric schedule for when the government chooses to put the power on. There's also fuel shortages. Again, the government owns all the fuel stations, so that's an issue. There was a decade-long civil war that ended less than 10 years ago, and it basically resulted in thousands of deaths and lots of displacement. It also meant that development was halted. The infrastructure that was in place was ruined, and a generation of children went without education. And then I also learned about kind of the complicated caste system there. So Nepal is mostly Hindu, but also Buddhist, and everybody gets along great. It's a really nice culture, but there's so many different castes, and there still are a lot of practices based on the caste system, such as arranged marriages. So in Pokhara, I was there for 2 to 3 weeks, and I worked in the LEBIRD offices there most days. I was kind of editing work, getting used to the organization, working in the amaranth trials there, that's a grain, and trying to figure out kind of what I was going to do there to be effective. I also took Nepali language classes, and that was my instructor in the top corner there wearing the hat I bought him. From there, we left to Kathmandu, which is the capital city of Nepal, and that's where we kind of went for a project launching meeting that LEBIRD was putting on with another organization, and it was funded by the UN. And so I kind of got to see some of the issues with the developing country working with the UN. Of course, language barriers, lots of technical issues, and then also just very different understandings about how projects should be carried out. And that's on the top left there is a roadside stand on the way to Kathmandu. And that's how most people do their cooking in Nepal. So after a few weeks, I headed off to Jumla, which was really my intended destination, and that's a mountainous area in northwestern Nepal. Jumla is also one of the most least developed districts in the country. So despite thinking that, okay, a few weeks in, I've totally adjusted to Nepal, I wasn't prepared for the poor living conditions in Jumla. They've just started building roads connecting the communities. There's also lots of power outages and water shortages. That's the typical house on the top left. That's a school at the bottom right. I was also not prepared for the language barrier. Basically, nobody in Jumla spoke English, so I really only could communicate with the one girl who came with me from the organization. So that was very challenging, but the people were great, which helped. And then, perhaps most unprepared was I for the sanitation and poor hygiene issues that were there. In the top left, you can see that's the family that lived in the building with us, and the little girl's getting her shower beside where we burn our garbage in the backyard. And of course, that's where we bought meat on the street one day, and to the right is our bathroom, where we do our dishes, take our cold water showers, and do our laundry. But there were some pretty incredible views. So my first few weeks in Jumla, I was really trying to get oriented and kind of working with the organization, seeing what they were doing, going to various workshops, doing various agricultural trials, and also a community seed bank or a community seed exchange at the top left there. But I really felt that I had a hard time fitting in, and weeks later, I still had a lot of lows and a lot of hard times. I was overwhelmed with the language barrier. I felt very alone, and there was no one I could share my feelings with. I also could not always communicate home because of internet and power outages. Cultural norms and gender disparities were another challenge, and that was one that I kind of realized after I came home, some of those things that were there. But for instance, as girls, we would never go out after dinner, and we were expected basically to be home and to go to sleep and to get up early and work every day. And that's just what you do there. Again, the sanitation was a huge issue. There was a lot of times where I was just kind of blown away by it. It was really hard to be around. I remember one day walking home from a village and seeing a baby lying near the road just covered in flies, and I just wanted to run over. It was everything I could do to keep myself, but it's just a daily it's the way of life there. I also felt like a burden. I felt like I wasn't contributing to anything, that I couldn't do anything. I couldn't really speak to anyone or take initiative, and the organization kind of really had to work to fit me in, so I was having a hard time with that. And then just when I thought, okay, well, I've hit a low point, things can only get better, a really close friend of mine and my roommate got very ill at home and was in the hospital, and that was another huge challenge because, again, lack of communication, and I can't be there for her. But luckily I stuck through it, and I ended up doing a food study in Jumla. So I really wanted to contribute something that I could see that was helping, and so I had my supervisor there help me devise something that they would find useful. And so I studied how food habits were changing in Jumla and what was causing those changes. But then as I started studying that, I really began to question how people were valuing dietary diversity. Because basically the typical Nepali meal is to eat dal bhat, which is that picture at the top right. It's kind of a mound of rice with a little bit of lentil soup and a side of curry vegetable, twice a day as their main meals. And so I was wondering, do people value dietary diversity? Because that has huge implications on how food security initiatives should take place. So I did a study there where we did focus group discussions. I did 8 of them, and we ended up talking to over 100 people. I had a person from the organization always translating for me, so it was very complicated, kind of, between me getting across what I wanted them to translate, them trying to take notes, carry out discussions, translating to me, and then me, trying to figure out what all this information meant and what people were trying to say. And on top of that, we were constructing a timeline. You can see at the top there, we got people to kind of share what year food changes were happening and why they thought they were happening. And Nepal has a different calendar. So right now in Nepal, it's 2071 the year. So all of that had to be translated as well. We also did, one of the group discussions was with youth, and one was with an all-women's group to get their perspective. So we found that food habits have changed a lot. Basically, there's a lot more access now that roads are starting to be built. There's a lot more access to different kinds of food, but at the same time, there's a lot more access to plain white rice, which is becoming kind of a preferred meal and is taking the place of a lot of local grains. The drivers for these food changes were very diverse, but primarily based on production rather than consumption. Pests and diseases, particularly rice blast, was a huge driver of change, but also climate change and food aid programs were cited as significant drivers of food changes. And then I found that dietary diversity was limited by availability and access, but also by food habits. And so I kind of concluded that people kind of needed to reacquire a taste for diversity. So after 2 months in Jumla, I headed back to Pokhara, and I was amazed at how many locals were all of a sudden speaking to me. I was very, very happy to have, cold drinks and real coffee and hot showers, and pizza, apparently. But I actually left the next day to Rupa Lake, which is about an hour outside of the city, and that's where I conducted a second study. So this study was community-based biodiversity management and women's development. So I was looking at community-based management of a watershed there. And I was really trying to figure out how women were involved and how they were benefiting, which is kind of lacking in a lot of that research. And I did that by looking at empowerment, how gender roles are changing, and how it's affecting their livelihoods. So again, I did focus group discussions, and I had a member of the organization working and translating with me. So we carried these out, 5 focus group discussions over a few areas across the watershed. So we found that it was, community-based management is a great source of empowerment for women. It was actually a great opportunity for them because a lot of men would leave for wage labor, and there's these positions that need to be filled, so women would get them. But at the same time, women are not allowed to be the president of the organization. They're not really allowed to take administrative or managerial roles, and they're not really able to make decisions either. Gender roles were changing and improving, but certainly still limiting. Women are typically not supposed to leave the house very long, and it was helping their livelihoods. They just certainly had improved access to credit and income. So in conclusion, I felt that this practicum was really great for me in that it tied a lot of the pillars of the MDP program together for me. I really got to see how they were all interrelated, particularly through the studies I conducted. And it certainly made me appreciate home a little more, and I feel like I learned a lot and took a lot out of it. So thank you.
It's really great to see the class that I taught last year. You all done a fantastic presentations. My question, I guess, is you really highlighted an important issue of language with the Indigenous group that you're working with. After that experience, do you have any thoughts on either cautions or positive ways when cross-language situations arise? Many of the MDP graduates won't be working in their home culture necessarily. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, thanks, Dan. I felt in one way I had a unique experience because I think normally if you're working in an NGO, you often have somebody, it's a little bit more planned out that you can make sure you're effective, that you can work with someone, you might hire a translator or something like that. And I, in an odd way, was not expecting to have such challenges with the language there. I guess part of it, obviously if you can learn the language, that's ideal. I tried, but it's still a slow process, right? And of course, saying basic words to people is not the same as being able to converse about development in their communities. So that was certainly challenging. At one point, I really did want to hire a translator, and so that's what most people do there. I'd only met 2 other foreigners in Jumla, and they were both young students like myself. They were PhD students, but they both had brought Nepali translators with them, so I think that would have been helpful. Also, we had a girl come a little later, and as soon as she came, I kind of said, I really need you to be, to be there for me, and anytime you can take a minute and just let me know what's going on, that would be awesome, because I realized it was challenging because I felt I could be learning more if I could only understand people and I could work with them, So I guess part of it is to be flexible, be aware that things are going to happen that you can't control, to go with the flow. You also need to trust people, and that takes a while, particularly with the focus group discussions I had, right? I'm trusting that the person translating for me is getting the information I want and saying it correctly and everything, right? Meanwhile, it's very possible that they're slightly biased as well, right? So it certainly is a challenge, but I would just say, to remain open and remain flexible and learn what you can. And it's amazing how much you can communicate with people just through body language and through, just actions and kind of helping each other and working together and facial expressions. So it was a really good learning experience. Yeah. Thank you, Dan.